The wind came down from the mountains like a judgment, cold, merciless, carrying the sound of something old and restless. Elias Ward stood by the fence line, his hands deep in his coat pockets, hat brim crusted with snow. He'd been waiting an hour already, boots buried in the white drift, eyes fixed on the distant cut of the trail. Somewhere out there, the stagecoach was fighting its way through the storm. He'd written the letter 3 months back. Short, practical words, help wanted for winter, room and board, fair pay. Nothing of loneliness, nothing of the silence that had settled on his land since May died. He wasn't sure why he'd even sent it. Habit, maybe. Hope disguised as labor. When the coach finally appeared, its lanterns dim through the curtain of snow, Elias straightened. The horses blew steam into the air as the driver pulled to a halt. A woman stepped down, clutching a worn carpet bag. Her shawl was thin, her cheeks wind-burned from miles of travel. She looked around, uncertain, until her eyes found his. Mr. Ward. Her voice was soft but carried in the cold. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," she nodded once. "Clara Bennett." From Topeka, he offered a hand for her bag, and she hesitated before letting it go. "It's a long ride from Kansas," he said quietly. It was. Neither spoke again until they reached the wagon. The silence between them wasn't cruel, just the kind that fills a place when words don't yet belong. The valley stretched around them in muted grays and whites. Willow's Bend lay 2 miles behind, its church steeple and water tower fading into mist. Ahead stood the ranch, 3 buildings crouched against the wind, roofs hunched like tired shoulders. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and reluctant. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and tallow. A fire flickered low, and the room bore the neatness of a man who cleaned without noticing why. Chairs pushed in, blankets folded, a shelf of tools polished with use. Yet everything felt untouched, as if waiting for someone who hadn't come home in years. Clara set her bag down near the hearth. Her fingers trembled slightly as she removed her gloves. Elias busied himself with the stove, adding wood, avoiding her gaze. "You'll have the spare room," he said. "It's not much, but the roof don't leak. I'm not expecting much." She moved about the room, taking quiet stock. A rocking chair faced the window, dust soft on its arms. Beside it stood a small table with a book of psalms and a cup turned upside down, as if waiting. In the corner, a chest half covered with a quilt caught her eye. Through a crack in the lid, she saw a hint of white fabric, delicate lace yellowed by years. A wedding dress, she realized, folded with too much care to be forgotten. Elias noticed where her eyes went. His voice turned tight. That was my wife's," Clara nodded, saying nothing. The silence that followed was a thin, breakable thing. After a while, she knelt by the fire and began to feed it, coaxing the flames until they threw light across the cabin walls. "You've got good wood here," she murmured. "Dry pine burns clean." Elias watched her hands, small, quick, certain. "You know stoves?" "My late husband was a carpenter. We lived through enough winters to learn what burns and what don't," he only nodded. There were questions he might have asked. How long she'd been widowed, what brought her this far west. But he couldn't seem to form them. Outside, the storm thickened, wind clawing at the shutters. Inside, warmth began to creep back into the room, the fire's light catching the curve of Clara's face, the dust dancing in slow spirals. She sat back on her heels and looked around. "You live alone here?" she asked. "Since 68. That's a long time to eat in silence." His mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile. Sometimes the silence eats back. The fire popped. She didn't answer. They ate supper at the small table. Beans, salt pork, and cornbread too dry to swallow without coffee. The clock ticked softly in the corner. When Elias bowed his head before eating, his prayer was short and murmured. But it filled the room like something sacred. Afterward, he showed her to the small bedroom, a cot, a washstand, one window facing the North Hills. "I'll tend the horses at first light," he said. "You can start on the kitchen and laundry. Pay comes end of each month." She folded her shawl across the foot of the bed. "That'll do." He lingered a moment in the doorway. Snow hissed against the glass, and for a breath he seemed to want to say more. But the words stayed behind his teeth. He nodded instead and stepped out, boots fading down the hall. Clara sat on the edge of the cot. Her fingers traced the seams in the quilt, stitches small and neat, the kind only women make when they're waiting for something to end. She thought of the journey, the faces she'd left behind, the empty ache of the road. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin like a living thing, moaning low through the rafters. From somewhere in the main room came the slow creak of a rocking chair. She froze, listening. But when she stepped out, Elias was standing by the hearth, staring at the empty seat. The chair moved slightly, back and forth, pushed by the draft. He caught her glance and turned away. "Wind," he muttered. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Later, when the fire burned low and the night settled heavy, Clara lay awake and listened to the old sounds of a house lived in by ghosts, the settling timbers, the whistle of cold through the chimney, the faint sigh of memory. She thought of the man in the next room, of his silence, of the ring that still glimmered faintly on his hand when he poured her coffee. Somewhere between exhaustion and dream, she understood that this place wasn't built for company. It was a shrine, half buried in snow and regret, and she had stepped right into its heart. But as dawn began to stretch pale across the frost-bitten hills, she rose, wrapped her shawl, and went to stoke the fire. The coals flared softly, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the cabin exhaled, a thin wisp of warmth climbing up through the chimney into the morning air. Elias came in from the barn, brushing snow from his shoulders. Their eyes met across the light. He gave a brief nod, almost grateful, though no words passed between them. Outside, the valley was still white and silent. Inside, two strangers stood between the ashes and the flame, neither sure if the warmth belonged to them or to someone long gone. The days slipped by without measure, each one folding into the next like pages in a book no one dared finish. The wind never seemed to stop its low, mournful hum around the eaves, and Clara came to know its voice as well as she knew her own breath. She rose before dawn, lighting the stove, boiling coffee that always tasted faintly of iron. Elias was already out by then, a dark shape moving across the pale fields, fixing the same fences that winter kept breaking. She kept herself busy. Work was the one thing that made the silence bearable. She swept the floors, mended shirts, milked the cow whose ribs showed through her hide. In the afternoons, when the light came through the window just right, she brushed the horses until their coats gleamed. The gelding ranger nuzzled her shoulder once, startling her so deeply she almost cried. Elias rarely spoke more than a few words. "Woodpile's low. Snow's coming. Dinner's ready." But she noticed the small things he did that language couldn't hold. How he left a lantern lit by the barn when she worked late, or how her cup was always refilled before she reached for the pot. There was care there, buried under the weight of something she didn't yet understand. Behind the barn, she discovered the grave. It was simple, no name, just a wooden cross bleached by seasons of wind and rain. Around its base lay a circle of small stones, and tied to the crossbeam was a thin braid of horsehair. She crouched there, the cold biting her knees through her dress, and brushed the snow from the carved initials, MW, that night. When Elias came in from the barn, she asked softly, "Was that your wife's grave?" He froze halfway to hanging up his coat. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, voice rough as sandpaper, he said, "May. She died the winter after the fire." "The fire?" He didn't elaborate, just turned away, staring at the wall as though the rest of the story still burned there. Clara didn't press him, but the question stayed with her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. A few evenings later, while searching for a needle and thread, she opened a cupboard above the wash basin. Behind a stack of folded linens lay a small leather-bound book, its corners singed and the clasp rusted with age. She hesitated, then drew it out. Inside, the handwriting was neat but fading, May's, no doubt. The first page was dated 8 years past. "He works from dawn till dark. The doctor says there is hope for the baby yet. I keep praying, though I feel God's eyes have turned elsewhere." Clara read further, heart thudding. "The fire took half the barn. Elias blames himself. I can still smell the smoke when I close my eyes." Later entries were more fragmented, the writing trembling. "He won't look at me the same. I think he sees the child's ghost in my face. If I die, I only ask this. Don't let him forget I tried to keep our home warm. The words blurred. Clara closed the journal, fingers trembling. The ache in those lines was too close to her own. A woman bound by love to a man already half gone to sorrow. She placed the book gently back where she found it. But as she turned, she saw Elias standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable at first. Then she saw the raw anger beneath it, not aimed at her, but at the wound she'd uncovered. "That's not yours to touch," he said, voice low but sharp. "I didn't mean, don't you think I've read those words enough? Don't you think I hear her voice every time the wind moves through that graveyard?" The fire crackled between them, small and helpless. She took a step closer. Elias, it wasn't, but he was already pulling on his coat, shoving open the door. The cold roared in, taking half the light with it. He strode into the storm without looking back. For a moment she stood frozen, listening to the sound of the wind swallowing him whole. Then she grabbed her shawl and followed. The snow was knee-deep by the time she caught sight of him. He'd stopped near the fence line, shoulders bowed, head bare, snow collecting on his hair. The lantern in his hand flickered weakly. "You'll freeze," she called out. Her voice vanished into the storm. He didn't turn. "Let it." Clara waited closer until they stood only a few feet apart. Snowflakes clung to her lashes. "You can't keep chasing ghosts out here," he laughed, the sound hollow. "Maybe I belong with them." "No," she said quietly, stepping closer still. "You belong where there's light." He stared at her, eyes rimmed red from wind and grief. For a long while neither moved. Then his lantern sputtered and went out, leaving only the faint glow of the cabin behind them. "I should have saved her," he whispered. "There's no saving the dead," she replied. "Only the living who keep standing in their place." The storm howled louder, whipping her shawl, but she didn't flinch. She reached out, not to touch him, but simply to stand beside him, close enough that their breath mingled in the cold. The silence between them shifted, softer now, something human breaking through the frost. They stayed like that until the wind began to ease. Slowly he turned toward the cabin, boots crunching over the snow. She followed, steps matching his, neither leading nor lagging. Inside, the fire had nearly died. Clara knelt, feeding it new wood. Sparks rose, catching on the air like fireflies. Elias sank into the chair by the window, the same chair that had rocked empty for years. For the first time since she'd arrived, it stopped creaking. The warmth spread slow but steady. He watched her work, the light painting her hair gold against the dark. When she finally looked up, their eyes met. His face was weary, but something in it had changed. That night, neither spoke again. But as the wind quieted beyond the walls, Clara sensed that a corner of the house had shifted, less haunted, less hollow. She had not taken the dead woman's place, nor did she wish to. Yet somehow, by standing in the cold beside him, she had reminded Elias Ward that he still lived among the breathing, and for the first time in years, he slept without waking to the sound of fire. The storm came hard and sudden, roaring down from the mountains like an army. By dusk, the valley had vanished beneath sheets of white. Wind clawed at the shutters, forcing its cold through every crack of the cabin walls. Elias moved from window to window, checking the latches, listening to the groan of the roof beams. It was the worst blizzard he'd seen since the year May died. Clara had just pulled the kettle from the stove when a sound cut through the wind, a dull thud, something heavy falling near the barn. Elias paused mid-step. The horses neighed, panicked, hooves striking against the stall boards. He pulled on his coat and hat, motioning for Clara to stay inside. "Could be a branch," he said, though his tone carried doubt. He grabbed the lantern and pushed into the storm. Snow bit at his face, stinging his eyes. The light barely reached 10 feet ahead, yet there, a dark shape by the barn wall. He bent low, brushing away snow until a hand appeared, brown and stiff with frost. A man lay half-buried, breath shallow, blood seeping through his coat. Elias turned the body over and saw an arrow wound along the ribs, the shaft broken clean. The man's eyes fluttered open, dark, clouded with pain. He tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. Elias didn't wait. He hooked his arms under the man's shoulders and dragged him through the snow toward the cabin, each step a battle against the wind. When he stumbled through the door, Clara gasped. The man's skin was blue with cold, blood freezing in thin lines down his side. "Help me," Elias said, breathless. They laid him on the floor near the fire. Clara tore strips from an old sheet, her hands moving with quiet urgency. "He's freezing through." "We need hot water, now." Elias fetched the kettle, his mind reeling. He'd heard the marshal that morning, warning townsfolk that a band of raiders had been seen across the ridge. "Any Indian found on white land," the marshal had said, "ought to be turned over or shot." But now, looking at the man before him, barely alive, ribs showing through torn hide, eyes half-conscious, Elias felt something older than law stir in his chest. Clara pressed a cloth to the wound, wincing as the blood soaked through. "He needs stitching," she said. "I'll do what I can." Elias knelt beside her, steadying the man's shoulders while she worked. The stranger's breath came in short, uneven pulls. When the needle pierced skin, he didn't cry out, only clenched his jaw and fixed his gaze on the fire. Hours passed. When at last the wound was bound and the fever began to break, Clara eased back, sweat glistening on her brow. The storm outside howled without rest, snow piling high against the windows. Elias stared at the man's face, seeing the deep lines of travel and hardship. "He won't last if we leave him," he said. Clara's voice was soft but steady. "Then he stays, until he can walk." Elias nodded once, though the decision weighed heavy. By morning, the world outside had disappeared into white. No sound but the wind's low moan and the creak of timbers. The man stirred, eyes opening fully for the first time. Clara knelt beside him. "You're safe here," she said, though she wasn't sure he understood. He watched her for a long moment, then whispered, voice rough, "Tayan." She repeated the name, testing it gently. He nodded. "Tayan," he said again, touching his chest. Elias brought him water, and the man drank slowly, eyes flicking between them both with wary gratitude. He pointed to the wound, then toward the window, shaping words they couldn't grasp. Elias caught enough to know he'd been hunted. That afternoon, while the storm raged, Clara busied herself boiling herbs. Tayan gestured for one bundle of dried leaves from his pouch. He crushed them, added them to the pot, and the scent filled the cabin, sharp, earthy, alive. Elias watched, cautious but curious. Tayan motioned for him to smell. He did, and felt his sinuses open, the ache in his lungs ease. "Medicine," Clara murmured. "He's helping us." The days blurred together in wind and firelight. Trapped inside, the three shared an uneasy peace. Elias repaired tools by the hearth. Clara sewed by lamplight, and Tayan, though weak, used his hands to fix what he could. A broken latch, a cracked handle, things Elias hadn't bothered to mend in years. At night, the storm sang through the rafters. Sometimes Tayan would hum softly, a tune low and mournful, like a prayer to the wind itself. Clara listened, feeling it reach places words never could. One evening, as they sat near the fire, Elias asked quietly, "You think he'll make it?" Clara looked at Tayan's sleeping form. "He's already survived what should have killed him." "That says something." Elias nodded, staring into the flames. "Marshall said raiders were spotted. Could be this one's the reason they come back." "Or he's the one they chased away," Clara said. Her tone wasn't defiant, only tired. Sometimes the hunted ain't the guilty. The thought hung between them. Elias rubbed a hand over his beard, uneasy. The town won't see it that way. Then the town doesn't have to know. He looked at her, really looked, and saw something in her eyes he hadn't noticed before. Not fear, but conviction. The kind that could carry someone through years of cold and loss. That night, the storm broke its peak. The wind screamed, rattling the roof, but inside the three of them sat close by the hearth, a strange family born of accident. Tayan stirred and opened his eyes. He gestured toward the window, then to his chest, murmuring a few words in his tongue. Elias didn't understand, but Clara did in spirit. "He says the storm will pass," she whispered. For a while no one spoke. They watched the flames bend and shift, the light playing across their faces. Elias felt a stillness settle in him, not peace exactly, but something near it. He saw in Tayan's endurance a mirror of his own, the same ache of loss, the same fight to stay alive when the world turned cruel. When he finally rose to check the stove, he noticed Clara had fallen asleep in the chair, her head bowed, the firelight soft on her face. Tayan watched her too and gave a faint nod, a gesture of respect, gratitude. Elias returned it silently. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind's howl softening into a sigh. Snow still fell, but gently now, like feathers from a tired sky. Inside, the three remained close to the fire, bound not by words or kinship, but by the fragile warmth they'd managed to keep alive against the cold world pressing in around them. For the first time in years, Elias Ward felt something shift in the air of his home, not the absence of ghosts, but the presence of the living. Wind scraped across the thawing fields, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil, a faint promise that winter was losing its grip. But with the melt came danger. By noon, the first riders appeared on the ridge, soldiers in dust-caked blue, their rifles glinting like teeth in the pale sun. Clara saw them from the window, her heart tightening as if the world itself had narrowed to the sound of hooves and authority. The marshal came ahead of them, his badge half hidden beneath his coat. He nodded to Elias, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Word from Fort Shelby. There's a fugitive native running loose in these parts. We got tracks that lead close to your land. You seen anyone out of place?" Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the barn, to the faint line of smoke curling from its roof, the remnants of the night's fire where Tayan had slept. "No," he said finally. "Ain't seen a soul." But the marshal wasn't convinced. He shifted in his saddle, studying Elias with a weary kind of knowing. "You're a good man, Ward. Don't ruin that trying to play savior. They'll hang a man just as easy for mercy as for murder." When the soldiers rode off to search the far creek, Clara came to Elias with trembling hands. "You can't keep him here," she whispered. "If they find him." He turned to her, eyes hollow but steady. "If I give him up, I bury what little good I've got left." The word struck her like a confession, not of rebellion, but of a man clawing for his own soul. Inside, Tayan understood enough to know the danger. He gathered his things quietly, a knife, a pouch of herbs, the ragged blanket Clara had stitched to warmth. "Go," she whispered, pressing her shawl into his hands. "Take this. The nights are cruel yet." He looked at her for a long time, then touched his forehead in silent gratitude. That night, the wind carried no sound but the soft closing of the door. Clara lay awake, listening to the hollow space where another heartbeat had been. At dawn, the soldiers returned, their boots heavy, their eyes sharper. They didn't knock this time. They stormed the cabin, overturning chairs, tearing through cupboards, their orders slicing the air. Elias stood by the hearth, rifle leveled but calm. One wrong twitch and the whole world could end. "Where is he?" the marshal demanded. Elias said nothing. His silence was his verdict. They searched the barn, the loft, the woodpile, and found nothing. No footprints, no trail. Tayan was gone, swallowed by the pines like a spirit the earth had reclaimed. When the riders finally left, their curses fading into the hills, Clara sagged against the wall, breath shaking. Elias leaned his rifle against the doorframe and stared out toward the trees. The snow there gleamed faintly in the sun, untouched, endless and free. In that quiet, Clara saw something change in him. Not joy, not triumph, but peace, the kind that comes after a man has done what his conscience demanded, even if the world never knows. She stepped beside him, her hand finding his arm. He didn't look at her, but she felt him breathe deeper, slower, as though the burden he'd carried had shifted, just enough for the light to reach through. Outside, the thawing valley shimmered, a place between winter and spring, between sin and grace. And in that fragile in-between, their bond took root, quiet and unseen, like a seed buried deep beneath the melting snow. The first true rain of spring came quietly, a slow weeping sky over the valley, washing the last traces of winter from the soil. Elias worked along the roofline that morning, hammer steady, shirt damp with sweat. Below, Clara knelt in the earth, planting lilacs near May's grave, soft purple blooms for a woman she'd never known, but felt as though she'd lived beside all her life. For days, the rhythm of the ranch changed. Elias repaired fences, mended saddles, and even whistled once, though he stopped halfway through, embarrassed by the sound. Clara cooked stew and stitched curtains from an old dress, her laughter slipping, hesitant, into the air between them. The cabin began to breathe again. But that night the rain came harder, wild and sharp, drumming against the windows. Lightning flared across the hills, and a single strike split the pine near the barn. The sound was deafening, a crack like judgment. Within seconds, the roof caught fire. Elias was already running before Clara could scream his name. He vanished into the black wind, rain whipping his face, boots sinking in the mud. The barn was a furnace, horses thrashing in terror. He forced the door open, smoke swallowing him whole. Clara followed with a bucket, coughing, her skirt soaked and heavy. Together they worked in frantic rhythm, he leading out the horses, she dousing the straw, her arms trembling from the strain. A beam cracked overhead and fell. She saw it too late. Elias lunged, shoving her clear as the timber crashed down beside them. For a heartbeat, she thought the world had ended. Then his arms were around her, pulling her up, his breath ragged, eyes wide and wild. "Clara," he rasped, voice breaking in the smoke. "I'm fine," she coughed, though her knees were shaking, her hands black with ash. He held her there in the rain, both of them trembling, the fire hissing as the downpour fought to smother it. The world was chaos, red, black, and thunder, but inside that chaos, something unspoken burned brighter. He didn't let go. When it was over, they stood among the ruins. The barn was half collapsed, horses safe, but the air thick with the smell of smoke and wet timber. Clara leaned against him, exhausted. He brushed a lock of hair from her cheek, a gesture so gentle it frightened him. Inside the cabin, she wrapped a blanket around them both. The fire crackled low, its warmth steady and forgiving. He stared into the flames for a long while before he spoke. "I thought I couldn't love again," he said softly. "Not without betraying her." Clara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Maybe love's not a betrayal," she whispered. "Maybe it's what keeps her alive." He turned then, really seeing her, her hands raw, her face smudged with soot, her hair damp and loose. She looked like something born of the same storm that had nearly taken them both. His hand found hers beneath the blanket, hesitant, rough. She didn't move away. Outside, rain still fell, steady and soft. The lilacs bent beneath it, their petals glimmering with drops that caught the faintest hint of moonlight. The valley was washed clean, the air carrying the scent of earth and smoke and something new, something alive. Elias leaned back, eyes half closed, feeling the weight of all that had passed. The graves, the silence, the guilt. For the first time in years, it didn't crush him. It simply existed, like the memory of winter beside the promise of spring. And beside him, wrapped in the same worn blanket, Clara breathed in the rhythm of the rain, steady, human, alive. A heartbeat that was no longer his alone. By early summer, the valley no longer whispered of winter. It murmured of consequence. Word had slipped from one saloon mouth to another, gathering weight as it rolled through Willow's Bend. Elias Ward had harbored a fugitive, they said. An Indian. One the soldiers had been ordered to shoot on sight. By the week's end, there was talk of a bounty, and the marshal was saddling men to ride. Clara heard it first at the trading post, the air thick with gossip and gun oil. "They'll come for him," someone muttered. "Ain't no use standing in front of a bullet for pride." She walked home in silence, the dust of the road rising behind her like ghosts. Elias was mending the corral when she told him. He didn't curse, didn't shout, only set down his tools and stared toward the hills, where the sun was sinking behind a pale line of thunderclouds. "I reckon it was only a matter of time," he said quietly. That night he packed his saddlebag, a bit of jerky, his father's knife, the ledger with the deed to the ranch. Clara stood in the doorway, rain drumming on the roof. "You're not running," she said. "No," he replied. "I'm going to make it right. They'll take me in. Maybe I can speak for what really happened. And if they don't listen?" He met her eyes then, a look stripped of all illusion. "Then I die for something that finally mattered." She wanted to stop him, to grab his arm, to make him see that the world still needed him. But something in his gaze told her this was a road he'd been walking long before she came. He left before dawn. The fields were silver with dew, the world quiet, but for the creak of the saddle and the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. By midday, the river came into view, swollen from rain, its current brown and restless. That's where he saw the figure on the far bank, Tayan. The native man stood straight despite the scars on his shoulder. His eyes calm in the stormlight. They regarded each other for a long time, two men bound by the same choice, the same refusal to look away from what was right. Tayan raised a hand, then pointed upriver, toward the old trail that wound through the granite hills. "Soldiers," he said in broken English, motioning east. "Come." Elias hesitated. "You saved me once," he said. "You don't owe me." Tayan only shook his head. "Brothers pay no debts. They walk." So they rode together, silent through the rain, crossing through the old pines and shale paths, slick with mud. Behind them, the thunder of the posse faded into distance. Elias knew every hoofbeat carried him further from the gallows, but also from the man he had been. By nightfall, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. Tayan stopped and turned, the wind tugging at his dark hair. "Go," he said. "You have woman, home." Elias looked back toward him, wanting to speak, but finding no words large enough for what had been shared. Not gratitude, not brotherhood, but something older, elemental. He reached into his pocket, drew out the knife his father had given him, and pressed it into Tayan's hand. "A man should carry a thing that's been forgiven," he said softly. Tayan nodded once. Then he disappeared into the trees. When Elias rode back into the valley 2 days later, the air smelled of wet earth and lilacs. The cabin rose ahead, smoke curling from the chimney. Clara was on the porch, her hair unpinned, 2 mugs of coffee steaming beside her. She didn't move when he dismounted. She only watched, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and prayer. "You came back," she whispered. He smiled faintly, the lines of weariness easing from his face. "I reckon I did." They sat together as dusk fell, the horizon awash of gold and violet. The grave by the barn, May's, was blooming wild with flowers Clara had tended. Elias walked to it, the old ring heavy on his finger. He knelt, set it gently upon the stone, and bowed his head. "For every road I couldn't walk with you," he murmured. "Thank you for the ones you left behind." When he turned back, Clara was there, quiet, steady, the wind tugging at her shawl. "They said no man could have 2 brides," he said softly. "But I do. One buried in my heart and one beside me now." Clara didn't answer. She only reached for his hand, and together they stood watching the valley breathe, the grass bending in the twilight wind, the river glinting like a ribbon of forgiveness. The air smelled of coffee and rain, and something holy. For the first time in years, Elias Ward felt whole, not because his grief had vanished, but because it had finally found its place beside the living. And as night settled over Willow's Bend, the cabin windows glowed warm against the dark, a beacon for anyone lost between love and loss, proof that even in the loneliest corners of the frontier, hearts could still find their way home.